I want you to remember this sound. A pen clicking against a glass conference table. Over and over, while my sister smiled at me like I'd just handed her the best gift of her life. That click is the last thing I remember before everything I thought I knew about my family fell apart in front of a stranger in a gray suit. But to understand why that sound still wakes me up some nights, you need to go back 3 years. To a kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee and a father who was running out of time. My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm 34 years old. And for a long time I was the daughter who stayed. My father, Walter Whitfield, ran a small hardware store in the town of Belhaven for almost 40 years. It wasn't glamorous. It smelled like sawdust and WD-40. And the register still made that satisfying mechanical thunk when you closed the drawer. My mother passed when I was 26. And after that, my father started slipping. Not all at once. Small things first. He'd forget to lock up the store. He'd call me by my mother's name and then catch himself. Embarrassed. Then came the diagnosis, early onset vascular dementia. Compounded by a heart condition that made every doctor use the word unpredictable a little too often. My younger sister, Renee, was 29 at the time. She lived 2 states away, in a city with a skyline and a job in marketing that she posted about constantly. Renee was always the golden one growing up. Smarter grades, effortless charm, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone forget what they were arguing about. I never resented her for it. I loved her. I still do, in the complicated way you love someone who shares your childhood and then chooses a different life. When Dad's condition worsened, someone had to move back to Belhaven. Renee had just gotten a promotion. She had a leash she couldn't break. She had reasons. And I understood them, or at least I told myself I did. So I quit my job as a paralegal in Columbus. Packed up my apartment, and moved back into my childhood bedroom to take care of a man who sometimes didn't remember I was his daughter. I want to be clear about something before I go further. Because it matters for everything that happens later. I did not do this for money. I did not do this expecting anything. I did it because he was my father. And because somebody had to hold his hand at 3 in the morning when he woke up terrified and didn't know where he was. For 2.5 years, that was my life. I managed his medications. I drove him to appointments in 3 different cities. I kept the hardware store running with the help of his longtime employee. A quiet man named Curtis who'd worked the paint counter since before I was born. I paid bills out of my own dwindling savings when the store's revenue dipped because Dad could no longer make the decisions that used to come naturally to him. Renee visited 4 times in 2.5 years. Each visit lasted a weekend. Each time, she left with a hug, a promise to do better, and a look on her face like she'd just run a marathon. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a martyr. I'm telling you because sacrifice, when it's real, doesn't announce itself. It just becomes the shape of your days. And I want you to understand the shape of mine. Because later, someone tried to convince me it didn't count for anything. The first warning sign came about 8 months before my father died. Though I didn't recognize it as a warning at the time. Renee started calling more often. Not to check on Dad, to ask questions. Careful, casual-sounding questions. Has Dad talked to a lawyer about the store? Do you know if his will is updated? Who's handling the deed to the house? I answered honestly. Because why wouldn't I? I told her Dad had an old will from years back. Drafted not long after Mom passed, that split everything between the 2 of us evenly. The house, the store, his modest savings. 50-50. I told her he hadn't updated it. Mostly because updating it required a level of clarity he didn't reliably have anymore. Renee's response stuck with me, though I brushed it off then. She said, "That doesn't seem fair to you. Though. You've done so much. Maybe we should talk to someone about adjusting it." I remember feeling touched. I thought she meant adjusting it in my favor. Acknowledging what I'd given up. I was wrong about what she meant. I just didn't know it yet. My father died on a Tuesday in March. In the hospital, with my hand in his. Renee arrived 4 hours after he passed. Having taken the first flight she could get. I don't fault her for the timing. Death doesn't wait for flight schedules. But I remember standing in that hospital hallway. Hollowed out, and watching my sister cry real tears. And feeling something I wasn't proud of, a flicker of doubt about whether the grief was entirely for him. Or partly for what came next. The funeral was small. Curtis closed the store for the day out of respect. Something Renee mentioned twice, as if it were a strange or excessive gesture. That should have told me something too. About 3 weeks after the funeral, Renee called and said we needed to get our ducks in a row with the estate. She said she'd found a lawyer, someone efficient. Someone who could help us move through this quickly so we don't have to keep reliving it. She said his name was Gordon Pruitt. And he specialized in estate settlements. I remember thinking it was thoughtful of her to take initiative. I remember being grateful I didn't have to manage one more thing. That gratitude is what she was counting on. The first meeting with Mr. Pruitt took place in his office in the city. The kind of office with a view and furniture that looked like it cost more than my car. Renee was warm that day, warmer than she'd been in months. She held my hand in the elevator. She told me she didn't know what she would have done without me these past few years. I believed every word of it, because I wanted to. Mr. Pruitt explained the estate. The house. Appraised at around $210,000. The hardware store property and business, valued. With inventory and goodwill, at roughly $340,000. Dad's savings and a small life insurance policy. Another $60,000 combined. Under the old will. Split evenly, that meant a little over $300,000 each. Then Mr. Pruitt said something that should have raised more alarm in me than it did. He said Renee had asked him to draft an additional document, an inheritance waiver, for me to consider signing. He explained, in careful legal language, that a waiver like this would mean I formally gave up my claim to a portion of the estate. Specifically the hardware store and its associated property. In exchange for what he called other considerations to be arranged privately between the parties. I looked at Renee. She squeezed my hand under the table and said, "Dana, hear me out before you say anything." Here's what she told me. Sitting in that office, with a straight face and gentle eyes. She said she'd been thinking a lot about fairness. She said that because I'd lived in Belhaven and run the store day to day these past years, it made more sense, tax-wise and logistically, for the store and its property to go entirely to her. Since she had connections in the city who could help sell it quickly for a better price. In exchange, she said, she would give me a larger share of the house and the liquid savings. Plus what she called a little extra. Out of my own pocket, once the store sells. Because you earned it. She said the waiver was just a formality to simplify the paperwork and speed up the process so we wouldn't be tied up in probate court for a year. She said, and I remember this sentence exactly because it's the sentence I've replayed more than any other in my life. I don't want money to come between us. I just want this to be easy so we can both move on. I want to tell you I hesitated longer than I did. I want to tell you I asked more questions. But grief makes you tired in a way that's hard to describe unless you've lived it. I had spent 2.5 years being the strong one. The responsible one, the one who handled everything. And here was my little sister, finally. It seemed, stepping up, offering to take something off my plate. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. Mr. Pruitt, to his credit, paused before sliding the document across the table. He looked at me and said, "Ms. Whitfield, I want to note for the record that this waiver is significant. It permanently forfeits any claim to the business and commercial property, regardless of any private arrangements discussed outside this office. I'd strongly recommend you have your own attorney review this before signing anything." Renee laughed softly. The kind of laugh meant to defuse tension. And said, "Gordon, you're scaring her. It's just us. We don't need lawyers pointing fingers at each other. It's family." I signed the waiver that day. I remember the pen. I remember the small, satisfied smile that crossed my sister's face the second the ink dried. A smile she tried to cover by pulling me into a hug. I remember her saying, into my shoulder, "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me." I thought she meant it emotionally. I didn't understand yet that she meant it financially. And very specifically. For the next several weeks, Renee was a different person. Attentive. Affectionate. She called just to talk, something she hadn't done in years. She sent me a link to apartment listings in the city, saying, "Once things settle, you should think about starting fresh somewhere new. You deserve it." I let myself feel hopeful. I let myself believe that grief had somehow repaired something between us that had been broken since childhood. The first crack appeared about 6 weeks later. When I called Curtis at the store to check on the transition paperwork Renee had mentioned. Curtis sounded confused. He said, "Transition to what? Nobody's told me anything about the store being sold. I've just been running things like normal." I told him Renee mentioned it was being handled. He said, carefully, "Dana, I think you should come down here." When I arrived, Curtis showed me a letter that had come to the store addressed to Renee. Care of the business, from a commercial real estate firm in the city. It wasn't about selling the store. It was a formal notice regarding zoning variance approval for redevelopment. My father's hardware store sat on a corner lot at the intersection of Main and Halsey. A lot that, unbeknownst to me, had been quietly rezoned 2 years earlier for mixed commercial use. Thanks to a city development initiative I'd never paid attention to because I was too busy keeping my father alive. That corner lot wasn't worth $340,000 anymore. With the new zoning, a developer had already made an informal offer, referenced in that letter, of just under $1 million. Contingent on final permits. I sat in my car outside the store for a long time before I called Renee. When she picked up, I asked her, as calmly as I could, whether she knew about the rezoning before we met with Mr. Pruitt. There was a pause. Just long enough. Then she said, I'd heard rumors. Nothing concrete. Why does it matter? It mattered because a waiver that seemed like a fair trade. A store for a house plus savings. Was actually me signing away nearly $1 million for a house worth $210,000. It mattered because my sister had let me believe I was getting the better end of a compromise while she orchestrated exactly the opposite. I didn't confront her with accusations right away. I'm not a person who explodes. I asked questions. I asked her directly, "Renee, did you know the store's value before I signed?" She got defensive fast. Faster than an innocent person usually does. She said, "You're being dramatic. I offered you something out of my own pocket. Remember? You could have said no. Nobody forced you to sign anything." She wasn't wrong about that last part. And it's a truth I've had to sit with. I signed it. I take responsibility for trusting too quickly. But trusting someone isn't the same as consenting to being deceived. And there's a difference between a bad decision and a decision made on false information deliberately withheld by someone who claimed to love you. 2 months after that phone call, Renee stopped mentioning the little extra she'd promised. Then she stopped returning my calls with the same warmth. Then, about 4 months after the waiver was signed, I received an invitation, not from Renee, but from Mr. Pruitt's office, to attend a final estate closing meeting to formally transfer title of the commercial property. I almost didn't go. Curtis convinced me to. He said, "Dana, whatever happens in that room, you deserve to be in it." So I went. The meeting took place in the same conference room as before. Renee arrived 20 minutes late, dressed like she was celebrating something. Which, as it turned out, she was. She'd already told a mutual family friend, who later told me that the store deal was basically closing today and that she was finally getting what she deserved after holding this family together financially for years. That sentence alone tells you something about the story Renee had built for herself. One where she was the sacrificing sister and I was somehow the one who'd gotten off easy. She sat across from me, practically glowing, and said, loud enough for Mr. Pruitt to hear, "Today's a good day. I really think this is going to set both of us up so well." She reached over and squeezed my hand again. The same gesture from months earlier, and I remember feeling sick. Because I finally understood what that squeeze had always meant. It wasn't affection. It was reassurance for herself that the performance was working. Mr. Pruitt opened a folder, and I want to describe his expression carefully, because it changed everything that happened next. He looked uncomfortable. Not nervous exactly, but like a man who had spent the last several weeks reviewing something he didn't like the shape of. He said, "Before we finalize this transfer, I need to disclose something that came up during my due diligence on the zoning and title history, which I'm obligated to share with both parties. Given that I represent the estate, not either of you individually." Renee's smile faltered slightly. "What kind of something?" Mr. Pruitt explained that in reviewing the original property deed from decades earlier, he'd discovered a clause our grandfather had attached when he first transferred the store to our father back in the 1980s. It was a rarely enforced but legally binding condition. If the property were ever sold or transferred outside of direct use by a family member actively operating the business, a portion of the proceeds, specifically 40%, was required to revert to whichever family member could demonstrate they had maintained continuous operational involvement in the business for a minimum of 2 years prior to any sale. In plain terms, because I had run that store day-to-day for 2.5 years while my father's health declined, and because that clause had never been formally revoked, I was legally entitled to 40% of any sale proceeds, regardless of the ownership waiver I had signed. Because the waiver addressed inheritance rights, not this older, separate contractual reversion clause tied to operational continuity. Renee's face went through several expressions in the span of about 10 seconds. Confusion, then disbelief, then something colder. She said, "That can't be real. Nobody mentioned that before." Mr. Pruitt, to his credit, didn't flinch. He said, "It wasn't something I was aware of during our first meeting either, Ms. Whitfield. I found it during title research required before any commercial transfer of this size. I have an ethical obligation to disclose it, even though I understand it complicates today's closing." Then came the part that changed the temperature of the entire room. Renee turned to me, and instead of apologizing, instead of even pretending to be gracious, she said, "You knew about this, didn't you? This is why you didn't fight me on the waiver. You were sitting on this the whole time. I want you to sit with that accusation for a moment. Because it tells you everything about how Renee's mind worked. She had spent months deceiving me about the store's true value, letting me sign away what I believed was a fair trade. And the moment the truth surfaced in her disfavor, her instinct wasn't guilt. It was to accuse me of the exact manipulation she herself had committed. I told her, honestly, that I had no idea the clause existed. I'd worked as a paralegal years earlier. But estate law wasn't my specialty, and even if it had been, nobody, including apparently our own father, seemed to know that old clause was still active. Mr. Pruitt confirmed this. He said the clause had been buried in a supplementary deed rider that even the county's digital records hadn't properly indexed until a recent system update. He'd only found it because his due diligence was unusually thorough, given the size of the transaction. Renee didn't believe me. Or she chose not to. She stood up, gathered her folder with hands that were visibly shaking, and said something I'll never forget. "You always do this. You always end up looking like the victim while somehow walking away with everything." Then she left the room. I sat there for a moment, stunned. Not by the money, but by the accusation. 2.5 years of my life, given without complaint, given without asking for anything in return. And in her mind, I was still somehow the opportunist. Mr. Pruitt closed his folder gently and said something I've thought about often since. He said, "For what it's worth, Miss Whitfield, I've handled a lot of estates. I don't often see someone react the way your sister just did unless they already knew the ground they were standing on wasn't solid." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I think he was telling me, as delicately as professional ethics allowed, that he suspected Renee had done more digging into that store's value than she'd ever admitted. And that some part of her had known this deal was built on something she hadn't fully disclosed either. What followed wasn't a dramatic courtroom battle or some satisfying cinematic reckoning. It was slower and quieter than that. Which I've come to believe is how most real consequences actually unfold. The zoning reversion clause meant the sale couldn't close as planned. It triggered a mandatory reassessment, and Renee, faced with either fighting me legally over the 40%, which would have cost her more in legal fees than she stood to gain by contesting it, or negotiating directly, chose negotiation, though chose is a generous word for how reluctant she was. We ended up in mediation, not litigation. I want to be honest that I didn't go into that room looking for revenge. I went in wanting what was fair, and what the clause entitled me to. Nothing more. The mediator, a calm woman named Ellen Vasquez, helped us reach an agreement over 3 sessions spread across 6 weeks. I received my 40% of the eventual sale proceeds once the developer's offer finalized, which came to just over $380,000. Renee kept the remaining 60% of the store sale, plus retained her original claim to a larger share of the house and savings from the initial waiver arrangement. In the end, financially, we ended up close to even. Maybe slightly in my favor, though I never calculated it that precisely. Because by that point, the money had stopped feeling like the point. The real cost wasn't financial. Renee and I haven't spoken since the mediation concluded 8 months ago. I've reached out twice, cautious, careful messages. Not about money, just asking how she's doing. Both times, silence. I've had to make peace with the possibility that our relationship may not recover. Not because of the money itself, but because of what the money revealed about how she saw me the entire time. Not as a sister who sacrificed years of her life out of love, but as an obstacle to be managed. A person whose trust could be leveraged if approached with enough warmth and the right timing. I still think about that hospital hallway, watching her cry for our father, and I still believe some of that grief was real. People are rarely all one thing. Renee wasn't a cartoon villain. She was someone who convinced herself, probably slowly and in small justifications, that she deserved more because her life had been harder in ways she felt went unacknowledged. Or because she equated my staying in Belhaven with weakness rather than sacrifice. I don't say that to excuse what she did. I say it because understanding it has helped me let go of some of the anger. Even if the hurt is still there. Curtis still runs day-to-day operations at what's left of the original business, now relocated to a smaller space 2 blocks over. Since the original lot did eventually sell to the developer, I used part of my share to help him get that new space set up. Because he stood by our family for 40 years and deserved better than to lose his job in the fallout of a dispute that was never his to begin with. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've had a lot of quiet nights to think about what it is, I don't think it's never trust your family or always assume the worst. I don't want to walk away from this bitter. What I've come to believe instead is something simpler and, honestly, harder to practice. Love and legal protection aren't opposites. You can trust someone with your whole heart and still ask a professional to review a document before you sign it. Trusting someone shouldn't feel like it requires skipping due diligence. And if someone makes you feel guilty or dramatic for wanting a second opinion on something permanent, that reaction is information in itself. I don't know if Renee and I will ever repair what broke in that conference room. I hope, someday, we do. But I've stopped waiting for it. And I've stopped rearranging my own sense of what's fair just to make peace easier to reach. I gave my father the last years of his life without keeping score. I'm still willing to give my sister patience, if she ever wants to have an honest conversation. What I'm not willing to do anymore is sign anything, or believe anything, just because someone I love asked me to trust them without proof. If you've made it this far, I'd genuinely like to know. If you were in that conference room, hearing your sibling accuse you the moment the truth came out, would you have walked away completely, or tried to leave the door open the way I have? Tell me in the comments. I read every one.